everybody! Welcome to the Jayda InStitches show. Granny squares are awesome. I mean, how many things can you make out of a granny square and then you find another project that uses granny squares? Crochet blocks for Afghan building and other projects are a cornerstone in all crochet repertoires. And today I thought we would take our granny square game to the next level. This is the mitered granny square. It's basically built the same way as a regular granny square, except you'll notice that its center is off center. And you can use it this way, or this way, or this way, or this way. You can create some pretty amazing visual illusions using the mitered granny square in a blanket, but they're also just cool for other granny square crafts as well. So, I'm going to show you guys how to do that today on the show. If you've already made the granny square original with us, then you'll have no problem zipping along with me, and I do move a little quicker in this tutorial than I did in the original granny square. So you know what a shell is, and you know what a corner is if you've done that original granny square tutorial with me, and you're going to hear some of that language repeated again today, but in a lot faster method. So, if you're ready to take your granny square game to the next level, like Granny Square 2.0, let's grab our hooks and our scraps and head to the craft table. The mitered granny square, in addition to having its center square off to the center, works on an even-odd pattern concept. So you always have to have at least 2 rows before you maybe want to change your color. This can all be one color, or you can change it up like I have, but it has to work on an even odd pattern system, and I'll discuss that in the tutorial. I made a 5-color mitered granny square, so I need 5 colors in whichever ones I like, and I'm going to make them all the same. You can use whatever yarn you like, just make sure that it's all the same type. So for example, all the colors I have chosen today are all acrylic, 4-ply, worsted weight yarns. This ensures that all of my stitches roughly end up being even. You need a pair of scissors, you need a yarn needle to weave in any of your short ends, and I'm using a 5.5mm hook, or an I9, but you are welcome to use whichever hook is comfortable with the weight of yarn you are using. If you want a granny square that has nice spacing and a comfortable, easy stitch because you're making a blanket, and you're using acrylic worsted weight yarn like I am, I recommend a 5.5mm, a 6mm, or a 6.5mm. That will give you a nice, comfortable stitch size and will give you a square that works out being between 7 and 8 inches square. Once you've got all those things, we can get started. Now, like a regular granny square, we have to start in the center. Where is the center, you may ask? Because this is an off-centered or mitered granny square, miter meaning quarter, the center of our square is actually down in the bottom corner. So it kind of makes for an interesting design, and it certainly makes for an interesting construction. But this is where we're going to start. So if you've done the granny square tutorial with me, we're going to start exactly the same way. We begin with a slip knot. There we go. Make sure it's not too tight or too loose. And we're going to begin by chaining 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're making ourselves a loop in which to work. So we're going to take our hook, put it through the first chain we made, and slip stitch. So pull back through everything. That will give us a nice circle that you can pretty much fit over your index finger, and that's where we're going to work our entire first row. We are using the double crochet stitch. So in order to bring our work up to the right height, we need to chain 3. 1, 2, 3. You'll have something that looks like this, a circle with 3 chains on top of it. Your chain 3 counts as a double crochet. And a granny square is best known for its use of the shell pattern. And a shell is 3 double crochets. So if you've done the granny square tutorial with me, you know shell, chain, chain, shell. We're going to double crochet into that circle, so right through the middle of it, 2 more times. And because our chain 3 counts as a double crochet, we only need to do these 2 double crochets to complete our first shell. There is our first shell. Now we need a corner. Corners are 2 chains, chain 1, chain 2, And now we shell into the same, sort of the same hole that we've been working into, so our same circle. We're going to double crochet 3 times now. So a shell is 3 double crochets, and the chain 3 at the beginning of each row counts as a double crochet. So 3 double crochets into that little circle we made. And now we're going to chain 2 because we need another corner. Turn our work again. Still working into that same circle, and you can see it's starting to get more and more defined because as you work more double crochets into it, it gets a little bit bigger for you. Double crochet 3 more times into that same circle. This is shell number 3. It's side number 3, and we're still on row 1. Okay, we need another corner, so chain 2. And our last side is our last shell. We need 3 more double crochets into that same center space. 1, 2, and 3. Now we're not done yet. Remember, you have to put in your last corner before you finish off row 1. And a corner is 2 chains. So we've got shell, chain, chain, shell, chain, chain, shell, chain, chain, shell. Each shell is 3 double crochets. Each corner is 2 chains. We've chained our last 2 for our last corner, and now we want to join to the top. So here's that chain 3 we created at the very beginning. You're going to take your hook, slip it through that top chain, wrap your yarn, and slip stitch back through everything. So, pretty familiar, right? That's how you start a granny square. I like to lay my granny square down, pick out my corners, pull it out a little bit, just a little bit of straightening, so you can really see the 4 corner spaces, the center corner space, and that is this part of our mitered granny square. So that is your center, and there's your first 4 shells in your first row. So we're not changing color, not yet anyway. We have to put on row 2. So this is what we do. We need to get up to the right height for the rest of our double crochets, so we chain 3 to begin row 2. You chain 3 to begin every row when you're making a granny square. We're going to flip our work so that the first thing we're doing is working into that first corner space we made in row 1. So make sure this is what you're looking at. You're going to work this way. Here's the corner space. You've chained 3, and now you're set up to work directly into that space. The first thing we're going to do is finish off our first shell. So there's our first chain 3, counts as a double crochet. We're going to double crochet into that corner space and double crochet once more into that same corner space. And row 2 has larger corners. So shell, chain, chain, shell equals a corner for row 2 and every other row outward. Whenever we're making a corner, it consists of a shell, 2 chains, so here's my 2 chains, and another shell, all worked into the same corner stitch. So we're going to double crochet 3 more times into that same corner stitch. And this will create a nice even corner. There you go. So there's your first row. I'll put it down here. It's your first row, your center, your first 4 corners, and we've worked shell, chain, chain, shell into our first corner. That's the first corner completed of row 2. Now, we're on a straightaway, and I like to give a little bit of space between my shells on all of the sides. This is another little switch up for row 2 and every other row hereafter. You chain 1 in between shells along a side. So not between, in your corners you've got 2 chains, because that creates a nice little 90-degree angle. But along the side you want to give it a little extra space, so you chain 1 in between each shell along the sides of your granny square. So the next space we're working into happens to be a corner space, and that means shell, chain, chain, shell. So 3 double crochets into that next space, which is a corner space from the row previous. So the first 3 double crochets, that counts as a shell. Now we need to chain 2 for the corner. 1, 2. And we're not done yet. We're still working into this corner. We want to complete that corner with another shell. So 3 more double crochets. And if you need help beginning your granny square, you're more than welcome to check out the granny square tutorial we've made here on the channel. I'll put that link in the description box below, and I go much, much slower in that one. All right, that's our first 2 corners of row 2 completed. Shell, chain, chain, shell, chain 1, because we're starting to create sides now on our granny square. Shell, chain, chain, shell, that's our next corner. We're kind of on a side, so we want to chain 1, just to give a little bit of breathing space between our shells along the side of our granny square. It's another corner square, or another corner space, so we're going to work 3 double crochets into that corner space. That is a shell. 1 shell equals 3 double crochet. You're going to be saying this in your sleep. There's a shell, we need 2 chains for a corner, and 1 more shell into the same space to complete that corner. 1, 2, and 3. Okay, that's 3 corners done. We need to do 1 more and we'll be done row 2. Chain 1, because you're on a side and you want to give a little bit of breathing space between those side shells. The next space we're working is a corner, which means shell, chain, chain, shell. 1 shell is 3 double crochet, just in case you forgot. 3 double crochets, chain 2, 3 more double crochets into that same space. That completes our last corner, and we are almost ready to close off row 2. Now, what's missing? I'll give you one hint. It's a chain. We want to join up our 2 shells, but we want to make sure there's that single chain between them because we're on a side and we want to make sure there's a little bit of space between them. So you look at your chain 3 that you began your row with, find the top of it, there it is, put your hook right through the top, wrap, and pull back through everything, and that is row 2 complete. Now, as you can see, I've only done 2 rows of that nice rich coral color. That is the very beginning of my mitered granny square. Here's where things take a turn. I'm going to fasten off my color coral. Don't need very much string, just a little tail. Get that out of the way. And remember, when you're fastening off, you want to take that little tail of yarn and pull it through the last working loop on your hook. Give it a nice tight tug. And if you wish, you can take this moment to weave in your ends, or you can weave in all your ends when you're finished. I like to do that. If I'm being picky for a gift, I'll weave in my ends as I go. But I'm just going to let that hang there, and I'll go back and weave it in when I'm all finished. So the next color is yellow. So I'm going to grab my yellow yarn. Here it is. And nothing fancy, you're joining a color, so we're going to begin with a slip knot. There we go. Make sure it's not too tight or too loose. Pick up your granny square and pick a corner. I like to go with the top right-hand corner, and this is where we're going to join our yarn. So you take your hook, your slip stitch, or I should say your slip knot's already on your hook. We're going to join our new color with a slip stitch in the corner space. So you put your hook right through that corner, wrap your yarn, and pull it back through that space and through that loop on your hook. That's joining with a slip stitch. And now your color is attached. We are still working the double crochet, which means in order to bring our work up to the right working height, we need to chain 3. 1, 2, 3. We're in a corner. We are going to work the tail end of a shell. So because this counts as a double crochet, we need to work 2 more double crochets into that same space. So you work 1 and 2, all into that same space. All right, this probably looks a lot like a granny square still, and it is. We're going to chain 1 because we are on a side and we are putting breathing room between our shells across the sides of our granny square. The next space we're working into is this nice little one we've got in the middle. So we're just working a simple shell into it. So a shell is 3 double crochets. This is not a corner, so it's just one shell, or 3 double crochet into that side space. There we go. We're still along the side, so we're going to chain 1 as a little breather. I'm going to ignore my little tail here. The next space we're working is a corner. So a corner requires shell, chain, shell. So we're going to double crochet 3 times to make our first shell. There we go. 2 chains. That makes the nice 90-degree corner happen. And we're still working this corner stitch, or I should say corner space, so we're going to work 1 more shell, 3 double crochets into it. 1, 2, and 3. Still on a side, we're working the next space, which is a side space, which means 1 shell. So we're going to chain 1 to get there. It's our little breathing room. And work a shell into that center space, so 3 double crochet. And you're likely saying to yourself, gee, Jayda, this really sounds like a regular old granny square. Where's the mitered bit come into it? And I say to you, hang on, we're almost there. All right, I've chained 1 because we're still on the side. The next space we're working is a corner space. We're going to work our first shell into it, so 3 double crochet. And then I want you to pause. 1, 2, 3. Ladies and gentlemen, the magic of a mitered granny square. We've worked 2 sides around our center coral color, in my case coral. We joined with a slip stitch, chained 3, and completed that shell into that corner space. Chained 1, shell, chained 1, into the corner space, shell, chain, shell, chained 1, shell, chained 1. We shelled into that corner space, and now we are going to create the miter effect. We are going to chain 3. 1, 2, 3. And flip our work. Oh yes. Now, we're going to ignore this chain 3 that we created. We need a chain 3 because we need to create a space. We need a kind of a straight edge, but you're just going to ignore it. Doesn't really mean anything. But you need that chain 3. The next space we're working is this one right here. We're going to shell normally into it. So 3 double crochets. 1, 2, and 3. Okay, there we go. Chaining 3 at the beginning of this next row, when we flip our work to create that mitered effect, is going to give us a very important space. So that's why I say just chain 3 and then don't worry about it. You're not completing a shell, you're not working a corner or worrying about a corner, you're just completing this little space, and we need that later on. So that's what you need to do. Once you've done your next shell into that space, it's kind of the same thing. You chain 1 because we're in between shells along a side. Here's your next space. You're going to chain 3, or I should say double crochet 3 times to create a shell into that side space, just like if you were doing a regular granny square. It's kind of like you're ignoring 2 sides of it. Chain 1, work into the next corner, which happens to be a corner space, so we're going to create a regular granny square corner, which is shell, so 3 double crochets, shell, 2 chains for that nice 90-degree corner that I like. Look at this long tail here, just ignore that. And 3 more chains to complete the second shell for that corner space. So just like if you were doing a regular old granny square, this is a regular old granny square corner, nothing out of the ordinary. Chain 1, because we're working along a side. Your next space is a side space, so it needs 3 double crochets for a single shell. 1, 2, and 3. Okay, still on the side, we need 1 more chain. And the next space we're working is still a side space, so we need 3 double crochets, because it's just a single shell required. All side spaces need a single shell, and a shell is 3 double crochets. So there you go, looking like a granny square. You know, you got your typical granny square corner and your chain 1 space and your single shells along the side. Oh my, we're at the end. Gee, Jayda, what do we do now? Well, I'll tell you. You're going to chain one because you're going to pretend that you were going to work directly into a corner stitch if it was there, but it's not. But you still want that little chain one to create a space. And you're going to look at that chain three that you began that first yellow row with. Find the top of it, pick a piece of it, doesn't need to be the whole thing, and you're going to double crochet into it. So wrap your yarn, put your hook right through the top of that chain three stitch, pull up a loop, and complete your double crochet. And I'm just going to turn this over so you can see the front of it. And I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm going to grab all four of my corners, even though they're a little different looking now, and give it a little tug. And that is the first granny square center, and now the next two rows in that lovely butter yellow color. Done! Look at that! Isn't that cool? I'm changing colors again, so I'm going to snip my yarn. Like I say, you don't need a whole lot of tail, just enough to create a decent sized knot. You don't want it unraveling on you. So I'm going to pull that through the loop, give it a nice tight tug. I'm going to weave in all my tails later, so I'm just going to ignore them. Looks a little messy, but that doesn't matter because we're in the creative part of this mitered granny square. So the next thing I did was add pink, and it's the same thing as the yellow. So you're going to grab your yarn, we're going to make a slip knot. Same thing, not too tight, not too loose. Pick up your granny square, and it's very important that you start on the side where you left off. So where you finished your last stitch, this is the space that you start in. You're going to identify that space, take your hook, and join your new yarn with a slip stitch, just like we joined the yellow yarn with. And now we're going to chain three to begin, just like we did with the yellow. 1, 2, 3. And just like we did with the yellow, we're going to complete the shell in this side space. So if we're in a corner space, we're going to complete the shell by double crocheting 2 more times into that space. There we go. Again, I'm ignoring my tails. I'm going to weave them all in later, so just ignore them. And we begin the regular pattern. So chain 1, because you're working a side, identify the next space, which is a side space, and work 3 double crochets for a single shell into that space. And here we go. The rest is the same. You chain 1 because you're working in between rows along a side. You're working single shells into side spaces. Of course, a single shell is 3 double crochet. You work the corner like you work a regular granny square corner. So by the time you get to it, here's my corner space. Chain 1 for the spacer, and then shell, chain, shell into that corner space. Just like if you were going around a regular old granny square. Chain 2 for that nice 90-degree corner. 3 more double crochets into that same corner space to finish that second shell. So remember, the corners need shell, chain, shell. And you're working a side. So chain 1 and work shells into the next 2 side spaces. Put a single chain 1 in between the shells, so you've got that nice little spacer stitch going. And then we come to the corner again. And this is how you work the corner on the first row of a color change. So something you need to kind of keep in mind when you're working a mitered granny square is that the mitered part of the granny square works on a 2-row concept. So you can make the larger part of your granny square any color you want. You can make it all sort of solid if you like. But you have to always join in a corner space like this. So see how there's a corner space created? We're going to finish off this row with 3 double crochets because we began it with 3 double crochets. And every even row, I should say every odd row, begins this way. So the odd row in this granny square begins with a slip stitch, chain 3, and 2 more double crochets to complete that shell. So the odd row begins with the shell and ends with the shell. The even row begins with chain 3, the big flip, and then you ignore that chain 3. And you work a regular old shell into that next side space. So unlike a regular granny square, that's sort of the same pattern repeating every single row, the mitered granny square has a distinct beginning and end that's different for rows even and rows odd. So on the odd row, you join with a slip stitch or chain 3 and complete that shell in that corner stitch, and you end 2 sides later with a shell. On the even row, you chain 3 to start and work a shell into the next space. So you don't do anything because you'll notice there's no space here. This is the tail end of a shell. Chain 3, skip over that shell, and work a shell into the next space. And you can keep going. You can make this one gigantic mitered looking blanket, or you can make multiple squares like I am and sew them all together to make a really pretty blanket. I'm at my corner. I'm going to work shell, chain, shell into the corner. And I'm going to let you guys work this even odd concept granny square. I'm going to work one more row in the green. And remember, the even row, you join with a slip stitch, chain 3, and complete that shell. You want to complete the shell. Every single even row, I should say odd row, begins with a shell, and zip, 2 sides later ends with a shell. The even row begins with a chain 3, you skip over that shell, and then the next thing you work is a space. It's kind of easy when you look at it that way to remember what side you're on. Because if you chain 3 and you're looking at a shell, that means you've got to skip over it. If you chain 3 and you're in a space, well, that means you've got to work it. So that's how you sort of remember which side you're on. Or you just count. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Even. I should say odd, even. Odd, even, odd, even. So you get to the end of your second or your even row. You finished your last shell going along the side. Remember to put in that spacer chain. You're pretending that you're completing your side, and you come up against the shell. So you began with a shell and you ended with a shell on that odd row. So you know that you have to end with a single double crochet. So you start with you start your even rows with a chain 3 and you end them with a double crochet. So just one double crochet. You look at that chain 3 and you identify the top piece of it. Just stick your hook in there anywhere you can. And just double crochet once into the top of that shell. And what you're doing is creating a corner space every other row. So there's a shell and a corner space, and a shell and a corner space. After every row, I like to stop and kind of pull out my corners just so I keep that nice square shape going. Yeah, and there's the pink done. So we start with a regular granny square, 2 rows, and then we join our new color. We do 2 sides, chain 3 and flip, and then work all the way back. I like to fasten off because I wanted to make every 2 rows a different color. And you do the same thing. So you chain 3 and finish that shell. So odd rows begin with a shell, a whole shell. Work all the way around, end that odd row with a whole shell. Chain 3, flip your work, and then the next space you're working, because you can only work shells into spaces, is over here, which means that you've got to skip over that shell and start your shells in the spaces. Corners are always the same. You get to the end of your even row, and there's no sort of corner space to work into, which reminds you that you chain 1 and then just double crochet into the top of that chain 3 that you used to begin the row with. And that is the secret. I'm going to go ahead, add my green row, and then come on back and I'll tell you how you make it look like a solid granny square again. Alright, I went ahead and added another 2 rows of color, and like I said, every odd row begins and ends with a shell. Every even row begins with a chain 3 and ends with a double crochet. So that's how you know what row you're on. I went ahead, added a 4th row of color, and now is time to do the border row. And the border row is what unifies your mitered granny square into looking like a regular granny square, and also makes it easier to attach them when you turn it into a blanket. So for my border row, I'm using white, because I just love that fresh, white, crisp look that it gives a granny square, especially one that's full of colors. And it's not too difficult to start. It's pretty much the same thing as adding the colors to the other rows. So there's a little bit of a magic part to it, but I'm going to show you as we go. So we're going to start with a slip knot. Same thing, make sure it moves around nice and comfortably on your hook. Grab your working square, and don't worry if you've got some sort of awkwardness or you think these side edges look a little bit wonky or bubbly. Remember, you can always take a moment to pull out your square. Grab those corners, pull them out, make it look a little squarish. Just scrape it, yank it, squeeze it, shake it into whatever shape you want. It's your work and it's forgiving, so make sure you just pull it around until it looks like a nice square. That way you also can identify all of your spaces and all of your shells, and you know where you're at. So you put that slip knot of your border color on your hook, pick up your granny square, and we start in the same top right corner space. That corner space is created by that double crochet that you finished your even rows with. So you see that? There's that chain 1, double crochet, and that's what creates that space right on top of that shell that you began your odd rows with. So you put your hook right through that space, slip stitch to join your color, chain 3 because we need to get our work up to the right height for double crochet, and we're going to work a shell, just like if we were starting a whole new row of color. So 2 more double crochets into that same corner space. That completes the shell. Chain 1 and work the next 2 rows just like you were working the sort of mitered effect of your granny this whole time. So you chain 1 in between each side shell. You work only a single shell into each side space. When you get to your corner, you work shell, chain, shell into the corner space, chain 1, and keep that side pattern going all the way down your second side. And when we get to the next corner, so not the first corner, the next corner, I'll show you how things differ. Okay, here's where we're at. We joined our new color, which is our border color, with a chain 3, and we finished that shell because we joined in a corner space. Chain 1, shell, chain 1, shell, all the way to the first corner. It's a regular corner, shell, chain 2, shell, into that corner. Turn our work, chain 1, shell, chain 1, shell, all the way to the next corner. Now, here we go. This corner space, created by that chain 3 that we finished our even row with, or began our even row with, I should say, is what creates this little corner space here. And we're treating it as a corner space even though there's actually nothing past it. We're going to shell into this corner space and keep making a corner. So it's now a corner space, we're on our border row, and we are going to do a regular granny square corner, shell, chain 2, shell into that same space that is a corner space, but kind of isn't. It's that awkward sort of concept, but it is. It's a corner space for all intents and purposes, because now we are squaring up our mitered granny square. So there it is, shell, chain 2, shell, into that space. Notice how it's turned it into a corner. The next space is this space down here. Remember those chain 3s I said that we began our even rows with, and I was just ignore them, just ignore those chain 3s. Well, they make these nice spaces, which now are side spaces for us. We're going to treat them just like, see this space here between these two shells? We're going to treat these spaces as though they're the spaces between regular shells. So these shells may be going sideways, but they still have a space in between. So we need to chain one, because we're doing a regular granny square side, and into that next space, shell. 3 double crochets. Chain one, because we're on a side, and into that next space, shell. 1, 2, 3 double crochets. Chain one, because we're still on the side, and into that next space, see how odd this is? Now we've come up against our original granny square, but it's still a space, darn it, it's still a space. We're going to shell into that space. 1, 2, 3 double crochets. Chain one, because we're not to the edge of our side yet. Oh, and there's a nice normal looking space. Look at that. Sits evenly between two shells. I am going to shell right into that. 1, 2, 3 double crochets. Chain one. Oh my gosh. And now we're at a corner space. And not only is it a corner space, it's a real corner space. Woo, rejoice. We're going to work a regular granny square corner into it. So shell, chain 2, shell. There's 3 double crochets, chain 2, and 3 more double crochets all into that corner space. Shell, chain, shell. That is a granny square corner. That is the 3rd corner of our granny square. Lay it down, grab your corners, squeeze it out a bit. Oh my gosh, it is so pretty. And you can see how we're coming along here. So we joined our yarn here, worked all the way around. We've come around our first real corner. I suppose that's our second real corner, because that was a real corner too. And we're going to complete our last side together. So we're going to chain one, work into that next space. That's 3 double crochets for a single shell. And the rest of this side looks a bit like the last side we just did. So all of the spaces are there. They're just sitting between shells that are going different directions than these ones. So you just treat them all like a regular old shell, or I should say regular old space in a granny. Just pretend not to notice that the shells are going in a different direction, because it doesn't matter. It is still a space, and it is still a space along the side of this granny. Chain one in between the shells along your sides. And we are on the home stretch, everybody. That's 3 double crochets, chain one, and I've got 1 more regular side space. 1, 2, 3 double crochets, chain one, and oh my gosh, I'm back where I started. This is a corner space. I began with a shell, and in order to complete my granny square corner, I need to put 1 more shell into that same space. So 3 double crochets. And to complete the corner, I need 2 chains. Chain 1, chain 2, and I'm going to slip stitch into the top of that chain 3 that I created, I should say I began the last row with. I'm just going to slip stitch right through the top of it. Ta-da! And we're done! Dee-diddly-dee! Oh my gosh, they look like 2 eyeballs. That is a mitered granny square. Now you can keep going, you can add another row of border. You can also just turn this into a regular granny square from here on out. You can just go around and around and around. I'm going to finish because I like the way this looks. So I'm going to snip my yarn. Don't need much, just a little bit, enough to tie a decent knot. Pull it back through that loop. There we go. Grab your yarn needle. and weave in all your little ends across the back so it looks nice and neat and tidy. The mitered granny square. Not as tricky as it looks. And that is it for this week, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already, because that way you'll never miss an episode here on the Jayda InStitches show. And you can also share our videos with all of your crafty friends on all the different social medias. And that is awesome too. It's a great way to help us out and share the love of crafting with all of the people that we love out there in the great wide world. That is it for this week. We will see you again very soon. Until then, stay crafty, be safe, and have an awesome week. Bye, everybody.